Uh, Firstly, I just want to say how pleased I'm to actually be back in the Mackay Whitsunday regions. When I got the email from Juliana, I quickly looked at my diary, realised I could be here, and basically emailed her back in minutes saying yes, because I was just looking forward to returning here. I used to come here quite a lot a few decades ago. There's people here who know me from different courses that I worked on with Neil Cliff when Neil was at the DPI, and we ran organic courses here. Uh, but I'm not here so much to talk about organic agriculture. I'm here to talk about what we call regenerative agriculture, which is a larger umbrella. And I'm now the international director of Regeneration International. We're actually registered in the USA, but we are a fully international organization with, at the moment, around 100 partnership organizations on about 40 countries on every arable continent. I just want to give our definition of regenerative agriculture, and we're using it as an umbrella term. And I'm using this word umbrella because what we want to do is be inclusive, not exclusive, and bring in all what we regard as like-minded agricultural systems, because there's lots of us out there. And, you know, these are the systems that use techniques such as longer rotations, cover crops, green manures, legumes, compost, organic fertilizers. And it includes a lot of farming systems such as organic biological farming. I know a number of you were down at the biological farming conference. We would see that very much as part of our, paradigm underneath the regeneration umbrella. Agroforestry, agroecology, permaculture, holistic grazing, intensive time managing, so on and so on. There are numerous systems, but one of the ones which is really important to us is agricultural systems that can increase soil organic matter, carbon. And I want to talk very much about that. My talk is agriculture and climate change. And the reason I want to talk about it is because this is the most important issue that is facing us as farmers, but also us as a species. In 2016, we reached 400 parts per million. Now, the last time the world reached 400 parts per million was between 3.5 and 3 million years ago. And when scientists looked at that, and now I'm quoting a very good peer-reviewed study that's published in the journal Nature, the sea levels were 20 to 30 meters higher, and the temperature was 16 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius higher, almost 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so 30 degrees Fahrenheit higher. What does that mean? Imagine a day like today, probably 34 already, and we add another 16 degrees to that. That's 50. What will that do to our cropping systems, our farms? Some people say, oh, we just turn up the air conditioners more, but we can't turn up air conditioners on our farms. Really what we're looking at is a mass extinction event. That's 400 parts per million. We're actually now 407 parts per million. The levels are going up at an average of 2 parts per million per year. Actually, in 2016, the year when we reached 400 parts per million, that year, after we reached that, we went up 3.3 parts per million, an 80% increase in the rate that we've been going up. So despite Paris, things are getting worse, and we're going into essentially unknown territory. If you have a look here, this is looking at ice cores. This graph goes back 800,000 years. Now, as a species, we go back about 200,000 years. We have never been in this territory as a species, humans. And really, we're looking at what's called a tipping point where we might be able to go back if we don't take action soon. I want to actually get things across as to what this means. You know, we are already 1 degree warmer than the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. People go, well, so what? What does that mean? Well, just think about the amount of energy that we need to heat up the atmosphere by 1 degree, but particularly the ocean by 1 degree. And that is the equivalent of the energy of billions and billions of atomic bombs. And I'm using this as a violent metaphor for you to understand. Let's not talk about 1 degree. Let's talk about the amount of energy now that is fueling our weather systems and our weather cycles. And it's violently pushing it. So our weather events now are more extreme. This drought we've got at the moment is the worst in recorded history. It's worse than the Federation drought, simply because now it's warmer, it's hotter. The evaporation rate is greater, which means things like the loss of soil moisture, but we're also seeing things like forest fires. Can I say this drought is global? California, the forest fires that they had, they've never had forest fires this time of year. Normally this time of year, they send all their forest fire fighting equipment down to Australia for our bushfire season. That's ended now as of last year because they're fighting fires in winter. So are we. Never happened before. The fire in California burnt out a city, Paradise. There's still 1,000 people missing. The bodies haven't been found. And, you know, last year, in the middle of winter, in Canada, they had a forest fire. Never happened before. What we're seeing now is this intensity of events. Category 5 cyclones are happening everywhere. You know, Debbie, get used to Debbie. She's a little girl compared to what we are going to get as it gets hotter. And Debbie's will get down and knock out Brisbane. And maybe that could be one of the best things that ever happens. We could actually put some common sense in the Parliament House in terms of, you know, once they cop it. At the moment, you know, we cop it. Well, you know, we're not really important. But I want to get across the fact that, you know, what is happening now is that our weather events are more extreme, they're longer. When rain comes, it's shorter, but it's destructive. It's also things come out of season. The way that we, as farmers, we could predict reliably and base our decisions, that is not so easy now because rain comes when we don't want it more often, and it doesn't come when we want it. One thing I want to get across too, that what this is doing is causing food shortages because it causes crop failure. The Arab Spring started because of an unprecedented crop failure in what were previously regarded as reliable farming areas. And there were food shortages. It led to food riots. Unfortunately, our governments got in and turned them into wars like Syria now. But all that started from food riots. Just think about when that starts happening at a greater scale on our planet. In September, there was a very important climate change meeting held in California. I was actually one of the participants of that. But for me, what was really important is that the head of the United Nations came out and said, you know, we've got, in this case, we've got 2 years to really start turning this around. If we don't, we're going to go into, you know, runaway climate change. And very important, we've got to halt deforestation. We've got to restore forests. But what I like, they finally got the message that myself and others have been working on. We have to change the way we farm. This is a critical message that, you know, is now getting across. Very importantly, for the first time ever at the United Nations Climate Change meeting in Poland next month, we've got farming on the agenda. People have tried to keep it off, but it's very important that we have farming on the agenda so that we have a say and that we can ensure that we have a future in farming with climate change. That's starting to happen. It took us 10 years to do it. We started in Copenhagen, and there's been a lot of work. But what I want to really talk about is the good news. I've just given you the bad news, but there is good news, and this is really important for us. One of the issues myself and others are working on is, and I'll talk more about the science of it, how we as farmers can, reverse climate change. I'm going to use the word reverse. We need to reverse it, take it backwards, but also make our farming systems resilient so we as farmers have a good future in climate change. And the most important initiative that I believe is ever launched in Paris, no one's ever heard about, it's called 4 for 1,000. Launched by the French government, who are the hosts of the Paris climate change meeting on December 1, by the French Minister for Agriculture, Stéphane Le Foll. And I'm actually one of the physical signatories of this document, and I actually regard it as probably the most important document I've signed next to my marriage certificate. So, but it is, for me, this document is critical because what 4 for 1,000 means is if we can increase the amount of soil organic matter by 4 parts per thousand, not 4%, 4 parts per thousand each year in our agricultural soils, we can reduce and reverse climate change. That's what French scientists have worked out, and that's where that name comes from. This is part of the Paris Agreement. It's also now, there's actually I should have, it's out of date, it's 34 countries have signed on. Several regions, for instance, California signed on in September. We've got the United Nations Food and Agriculture, IFAD, which is one of the other United Nations funding agencies for agriculture, the Global Environmental Facility, which is the main funding facility for environmental projects and for climate change. The World Bank is on board. The CGIAR group, they're the global group of agricultural research stations around the world. Hundreds of non-government organizations have signed on. So I want to show you that this is actually a really significant initiative. You know, the first signature on this document is Greg Hunt, when he was our environment minister. We've signed it, but Australia, unfortunately, given the current government's skepticism on climate change, isn't doing anything about it. But we are a signatory. So let's talk about this now. And is this doable? Or is this just another piece of paper? And soils are actually the greatest carbon sink after the oceans. Most of the CO2 that we put up in the atmosphere actually gets taken up by the ocean. And unfortunately, we're acidifying the ocean, and that's having a whole range of problems, especially for our Great Barrier Reef, but for a whole lot of ecosystems. So the fact is, we cannot put any more carbon in the ocean or any more in the atmosphere. Soils, we have over 2,700 gigatons, depending on the estimates, between 2,000 to 3,600 gigatons in soils. Biomass, which is the amount of carbon in forests and trees, is 575 gigatons. The atmosphere this year just reached 900 gigatons. So soils actually hold around 3 times the amount of carbon that forests and the atmosphere hold. Soils are the most logical place to store carbon dioxide. You know, to get it, we need to get it out of the atmosphere, out of the oceans. Where do we put it? We put it in soils. How do we do it? I will talk about more about that. But what I really want to go across here and just say, we have to go to renewables. That's non-negotiable. But going to renewables, and that's all we do, it takes, just say if we went to renewables tomorrow, which we won't, it will take about 100 and 150 years before what we've got in the atmosphere will naturally come out. So we will continue to go into catastrophic climate change. We have to urgently start drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And we need to do around 17 gigatons of CO2 per year just to stabilize. Now, further scaling up can reverse it and reduce it, or getting more renewables and putting less up. So in both of those can actually reduce it and start, and we can talk about reversing climate change. Is it doable? Well, let's look at some of the systems. One of my favorites is Colin Seiss in Golgon, and there are different versions of this. And I'll go into more detail into this later on in this presentation. But essentially, it's called pasture cropping, where he uses holistic grazing to graze down the pasture and sows in this case, oats, but sows the crop in it. Works on the principle annuals always come up through perennials. Now, he did this as a way of surviving to get a little bit of feed for his sheep. Little did he realize that he could actually put the header through it. The fact is, he's getting the same yield as his neighbors who plow up, putting lots of fertilizers, and but he gets a second crop after he's taken the grain off. He can put the sheep back out on pasture. Double income, a fraction of the production cost. In the beginning, he just put a little bit of phosphate because the soils are, like most Australian soils are low in phosphorus. Now he doesn't even do that. So virtually no input costs and double income off it. He goes from the bank almost taking the farm now, where he's doing all right, thank you. He's laughing. And so other people are doing it. I'll talk more about all these numbers later. I'll show this slide again. The most important I want to show is that he sequestered 168 tons of CO2 in 10 years. But if we were to extrapolate that by the amount of global agricultural lands, that is sequestering 80 gigatons of CO2 per year. That's significantly more than the 17 that we need. This is actually an improved, what I regard as a modified, improved version of it. One of the issues with pasture cropping, because you're not using herbicides, is breaking up the root mass when you plant your cover crop or cash crop. This is a relatively new piece of engineering where they just break the root mass and then at the same time just drill in or plant in the cash crop or cover crop in the pasture after it's grazed. Sometimes grazing isn't enough. He just puts the mulcher over it before he runs what he calls his soil key through it, and then plants his crop. This guy just puts a little bit of guano with the seeds at planting. One of the things that is critical in these sort of systems, if you get the biology and the fertility on the seed at planting and you give it a head start, the quicker that crop gets away, usually the better your yield is, the stronger your finish is. And that's all he uses, is a little bit of guano. Once again, his production costs are virtually minimal. He's doing cattle and grains and other things through it. Or in the case of this, just plants a really good, what we call cow salad, beef salad, multi-cover crop to run his cattle on, so you can get massive production off it. I know there'll be people talking about compost and compost teas. This is actually one of my favorites, done by Dr. David Johnson of New Mexico State University. It's an improved composting system. I'm someone who's been involved in composting for a long time. This one, in terms of the amount of biology, the incredible diversity that he gets, I've never seen anything like it. It's really simple to do. You can do it at any scale, from a small backyard to, you know, thousands of hectares. You can put it out as a compost tea, you know, through your or whatever, you know, through your planters, pelletizer. There's a whole range of things you can do. People can use existing equipment. It's what I really like about it. It's simple, it's doable. The yields he gets are just spectacular in terms of increases in yield. In this case, I just want to talk about soil carbon sequestration. If we scaled this up, and it's easy to scale up, it virtually costs nothing to do, we're looking at 184 gigatons of CO2 per year. Another one of my favorites are holistic grazing systems. And I know that some people say, oh, look, there's no science behind it. I can tell you now, there is very good science, particularly at Texas A&M University in the US, but now the peer-reviewed papers are coming out showing the multiple benefits of these grazing systems over fixed continuous grazing. So, you know, for those people say there's no evidence, the evidence is there, and it's overwhelmingly in favor of these. And the good thing is that now with these new publications, it gives you better insight in how to manage these things properly to get much better production outcomes at lower costs. But in this case, I just want to talk about climate change, because 68% of our agricultural lands are actually rangelands. The majority of agriculture is actually grazing. And in many cases, these are some of our most degraded ecosystems, causing a lot of problems. You know, here we've got problems with catchments and things. This is a good peer-reviewed paper looking at incredibly degraded grazing lands in Arizona and then restoring them through by using you know, holistic grazing. And there's a whole lot of really good data that comes out in terms of increasing water holding and stock capacity and ground cover and all that. In this case, we just want to talk about you know, sequestering carbon for climate change. And if we basically got our land managers to adopt these on rangelands around the world, just on rangelands, not cropping lands, just under 100 gigatons a year we could sequester. Very doable, you know. And so I just want to show you how doable these things are. I just picked two of these. You know, I can give you heaps and heaps and heaps of studies giving similar numbers of sequestration. It can be done, and it is being done. But just something simple like scaling up 10% of beam, just, you know, getting 10% of agriculture to use this composting system, which is really easy. Just getting 10% of land managers to start adopting holistic regenerative grazing, we would sequester, I've lost my thing here, but yeah, we would requester about 28 gigatons, just under 30 gigatons, which is significantly more than what is currently being emitted. In other words, just 10%, we could reverse climate change. Very doable. We don't, you know, these are shovel ready. We don't need to invent any more science or anything like that. It's just, and these are simple things we can just teach farmers how to do. And the benefit of all of these is that they actually increase the resilience and the output of farmers. It actually makes the farmers more profitable. It's win-win. You know, this is something that we need to get governments and others behind, that we can actually reverse climate change and improve farming. And so that's the next thing I want to talk about, is the reality is, climate change is not going to be reversed in the next few years. The reality is, as farmers, we have to live with things getting worse before they get better. And how do we do it? Well, getting back to regenerative agriculture, I talked about increasing soil carbon, organic matter. It's about organic matter management. It is really important. And organic matter is more than just a fertilizer. It has multiple benefits, and I want to talk about them. And really importantly, where we have peer-reviewed science showing how by increasing soil organic matter, you can get higher yields in climate extremes. Higher yields than conventional agriculture. That should be good news. It should have been headlines, but it's not. So let's look at some of the science. And this is a field trial. It's actually done in Switzerland, and it's the very narrow trials on the same plot of soil. It's just different treatments. One has been managed with good practice organic agriculture. The other one has been managed by one of the universities with good practice conventional. It's rained at planting. And here you see the soil's washed out. It's eroded. And those of us that farm know that when you see that lovely shiny area, that nice sheen stops water from infiltrating. It just flows off, usually with our topsoil into the rivers. How many times you can go out and you see that, and you stick your finger in it. By the time your finger goes through an inch, 25 millimeters, I grew up with acres and inches and stuff, so I'm bilingual these days when it comes to these things. But you stick your finger in, and it'll be brown, and it'll be dry underneath, bone dry. An inch under there, 25 millimeters under there. This one, most of the water's infiltrated. There's been very little runoff. That goes on to make a good crop. This will have to be replanted if you're going to get a crop. Otherwise, that's a failure. So let's look further into the science. And this is also soil from a similar long-term experiment. And you can see the difference between one that increases organic matter and the other one that doesn't. So what I meant to say here, the difference between these is the level of organic matter. This farming system every year had a slight decrease. Most conventional systems do. This one every year had an incremental increase. And this is actually year 16. You can see the difference in what the treatments do to the stability of the soil. This is the same thing. This is actually another trial, this case in North America. And the organic one has the higher levels of organic matter. The conventional one has been losing organic matter. You put that soil in water, and the one with the high levels of organic matter keeps its integrity. The water is clear there. Why? Because water is actually going into it. It's absorbing the water. The one with the low levels of organic matter has just collapsed. And, you can just see essentially what is the erosion, the mud that would go into the creeks and river systems because it has no integrity. And so I want to go further into the science to explain that and now show you a picture of one of the key components of organic matter. Organic matter is very, very complex, and actually so is this molecule, humus. But essentially, it's a polymer, a bit like a plastic. And you see it's shaped as a sponge. It is a sponge. And that gives it the ability to hold up to 30 times its own weight in water. And that's really important. The other one, I said, is a polymer. It's actually sticky. And so it sticks the soil together, and it's not water soluble. So that's the reason why that clump of soil keeps its integrity. The humus holds it together like a glue, and because it's not water soluble, it doesn't dissolve. So it's the same thing here. It gives the soil, because it's holding it together as a glue. When the rain comes, it's more resistant to erosion and being dissolved. It's very important. I'll talk more about how important it is also for storing all our nutrients. Because it's sticky, it actually stops our nutrients leaching out and going into the watercourse and into the Great Barrier Reef. But the thing I really want to get across is this, and this is really good work actually done in Australia by a master's student. And it's a really good average to explain how much water you can store in your soil in relation to organic matter. This ability of humus to hold 30 times its own weight in water is very, very important. So many of our soils, and I can tell you many of the tests I've seen here in this region have 1% or less. There are some soils here, particularly if you look at some of the original soils here that I've looked at, this is what they were. But through farming, we've lost it. So if you've got 1%, you can hold about 160,000 litres. The reason why I put 6% here, which is basically you can hold about a megalitre per hectare in the root zone. You know, the first 30 centimetres, the first foot. Think about that. You know, you get your soils up to 6%. And the reason why I chose 6% is because in my own farm, I went from less than 1% to 6% in 11 years. I thought I was pretty good. I know there's cases of people who have done it in 5 years and stuff. This is doable. I want to get that across. Some people, scientists say you can't do it. That's because they don't know how to do it. They're looking at the wrong things. But you know, there are practitioners and farmers who are doing it all over the world. Trust me on that. So think about this, that you can now capture and store a megalitre per hectare at the perfect place, the root zone. You don't have to, you know, build all these irrigation systems and sprinkler systems. It's there. And what I need to get across, I'll try and do this without making too much of a mess. But if you imagine you've got a low amount of soil organic matter, that's what you can store. Now, if I put more water in here, how much more am I going to store? It's going to run off. And when it runs off, it's probably running off with my soil. You can't, you know, that's what I'm trying to get across. You can store 160,000 megalitres, but if you get more rainfall, you don't capture it, it runs off. Especially with those soils that don't have much organic matter, it will run off with the soil. But if you've got a high amount of soil organic matter, you can capture it all and keep it and store it. Now, humus is very generous with giving the water back to plants. Clays will hold more water than sands, but clays are actually miserable at giving it up to the crop. There's a few plants like gum trees that seem to be very good at getting it out of clays, but most crops can't. So you've got that soil moisture, but your crop is hurting. But if you've got humus, this is the result. And this is, you know, the soil I showed you in the jar. It's come from this experiment in Pennsylvania. Now, you can see this is the same soil type. They're right next to each other. The same cultivar of corn, of maize. The difference has been in the treatments. And because this one here has high, you know, good levels of soil organic matter, it's captured the rain. So you go into a drought and it doesn't know it has a drought because it's got the water, and because humus is generous, it's giving the water to the plant as it needs it. This is struggling. And the peer-reviewed paper by Professor David Pimentel from Cornell University shows that on average, the yields on the organic in the drought years are 30% higher. Now, I want to get this across because this is really important in terms of, I'm sick and tired of people saying, oh, organic is lower yielding. We've got lots of data showing now that organic is higher yielding, and particularly under these conditions. What I want to talk about is good practice and best practice organic. Bad practice organic is lower yielding, but so is nearly every bad practice farming system. No one's got a monopoly on bad practice. But, what has been particularly found is when you start averaging these systems over a decade or so, when you go through the good years and bad years, we're starting to find these systems are, because they can keep their yield in the bad years, tend to be higher yielding over the long term. And that is really important for me to get across. The other thing to get across is this. Think about most farming is rain-fed. We can't even afford the, people talk about, oh, we need to go into irrigating to deal with climate change. We'll never be able to do it. One, we don't have the resources to dam every river and, watercourse, build all the channels, the irrigators and so on. That money is never going to happen. And secondly, it'd be one of the biggest environmental disasters if we did it. It'd never happen politically either. The reality is that most farming will remain rain-fed, and we have to develop systems to cope with being rain-fed. And this is the most simple way of doing it. It's really important to get across. I just want to show you just some of the, I meant to show you some of the data just showing that these systems are higher yielding. But more importantly, what I want to get on now is sort of like organic matter 101, just to start to give you a little bit of an overview of the science and of the practice on how to do this so that our farms have a future. And I want to start with this, the most important equation on the planet, or most important chemical reaction, where, do we have a pointer at all? Yeah, we do too. Great. We start, this is our so-called problem molecule, carbon dioxide, that causes greenhouse gases. We get 6 of them. We get 6 molecules of water, and with a bit of solar energy and photosynthesis in the leaves, we turn that into 1 molecule of glucose, which is the basic sugar, and a nice byproduct of 6 molecules of oxygen goes into the atmosphere. And this is the most important, how can you say, chemical reaction in the world. The reality is that when we look at any plant, 95 to 98% of its biomass is produced through this, carbon dioxide and water. Between 5 to 2%, in most cases 2% comes from the soil. Now that 2% is still critical, don't get me wrong. Fixing up the soil and fixing up deficiencies is critical to it. But what I find amazing, and those of us that have done agronomy, is that we're never taught about managing the 95%. That is forgotten. Everything's about the 2% or 5%, not the 95%. And I want to talk about that. And so photosynthesis produces the carbon compounds that plants need to grow. And I'll talk more about it. The 33% of these are usually exuded into the soil. But the most important one I want to talk about is the molecule of life, glucose. That's what our cells feed on. It's what sports drinks are, glucose, because that is our primary energy system. There are other ones like ketones and things, but primarily most living organisms, their cells burn glucose as energy, as fuel. It's also used to build a whole lot of other sugars as well, like cane sugar and fruit sugar, but it's synthesized through glucose. I think one of the things a lot of people don't realize, so all these sugars, you see this word O's, sucrose, fructose, glucose. O's is the scientific word for sugar. And so then you have another O's called cellulose, and it's cell sugar. And because the cell walls of plants are actually made from chains of glucose put together. And that's where we get wood, leaves, all the fiber. Is actually, it's a sugar. Water and sugar put together in such a way that's actually strong, you know. But, you know, and this is really important because, you know, I'm going to keep on coming home to this, because this gets broken down as glucose that feeds the soil web. But glucose molecules are also the building block of all the other compounds. If we get glucose and we add a little bit of hydrogen to it, we call them carbohydrates. That's starch. That's our flour, our potatoes, wheat, rice. We get the carbohydrates and we just turn it around slightly. We call it a hydrocarbon. That's oils, fats. You know, we live on fossilized hydrocarbons. There's, you know, the fossilized photosynthesis. All this, by the way, these are all synthesized with the energy in leaves. The leaves don't just photosynthesize to make glucose. They actually do all these other chemical reactions, make other compounds. And one of the most important are amino acids, or peptides and amino acids. And that's, they get the glucose molecules and they combine it with nitrogen, sometimes a bit of sulfur. And these are the basis of protein, our hormones, our DNA, and so on. But pretty well all life on this planet is dependent on glucose and the synthesis of glucose into the other compounds. You know, we essentially live off plants, or we live off animals that have, somewhere along the line have lived off plants, but we all live off photosynthesis. Everything, plants directly, we indirectly. And that's really important to get across. So let's now talk about managing the 95%. And now we're looking at using solar energy to feed our system. And like I said, plants are composed primarily of cellulose and lignins. And I'll talk about lignins a bit later, because lignins are what makes humus. But cellulose, remember, is cell sugar. So it gets broken down into glucose by microbes. An example of that are termites. They actually have microbes in their gut. They eat wood. Not a lot of things can eat wood. The microbes break it down into glucose and water. That's why termites can live in the most arid areas. They don't need water. As they eat wood, they get sugar and glucose and then use it for life. And heaps of other things feed on termites. But in the soil, the microbes break it down, and as they do it, they release glucose, and that feeds all these other microorganisms in the soil. It's the basic food of the soil food web, or the other word we're starting to use now is the soil microbiome. We talk about our body microbiome now. We're starting to understand now how important microorganisms are for our health, soil health. You know, once upon a time, microorganisms were seen as disease. You had a fungus, you need to kill it. You had bacteria, you need to kill it. Now we're starting to understand it's the other way around. We need to have healthy microbiomes. And so what we want to do now is power our soil microbiome, our soil food web, and we do that through photosynthesis. So basically what I want to say is the more solar collectors you have collecting the solar energy falling on your farm, the more glucose you make, the more energy, the more fuel you put into your system, the more production you get out. When you start thinking in terms of a biological system, this is what feeds it. This is 95 to 98%, not the amount of fertilizers you pour on. At the moment, you know, if you want to look at farming and look at the amount of fertilizers being put on now compared to what was done in the 70s, and look at the yields now compared to the 70s, we're putting on more fertilizer and we're getting lower yields. Why? And part of it is because we don't understand the fertilizers are 5%, they're not 95%. So one way to talk about it is recycling, you know, wood and leaves and organic matter of plants, crops, animals. But I want to talk about the one that people forget all the time. It's not about just recycling, putting compost in or plowing in or cutting in a cover crop. You know, where a significant amount of the carbon comes from is directly from the roots. We call it the carbon gift. Between 30 to 60% of the carbon and energy fixed by photosynthesis, the roots actually secrete into the soil. In part, you know, soil is a very abrasive environment, and if you look at a root, you know, you just got to touch it a bit hard and you break it. You know what the soil does to our implements. It's incredibly abrasive, and here you've got this very soft root growing in an abrasive environment. It does it by protecting the tip by having what are called leaf sheaths. The best way to say is you look at the outer sepals of a flower, you know, those sheaths that protect the flower before it opens. It's the same with roots, and as they grow, they shed them off, and that goes into the soil. But they also put in lubricating compounds, pH adjusting compounds, and actually they put out sugars to actually feed microorganisms as well. And what we know is that they're actually putting out thousands of tons of organic carbon into the soil. As they grow. So I'll talk more about, but these root exudates actually feed microbial communities, all that carbon, as they grow. When we talk about, what I want to get across here is when we look at the biomass of a plant, usually actually these are perennial grasses, and they tend to have a bigger root mass than leaf mass. But most plants, the rule of thumb is what you see up above, the same below in roots. But what we can say is that there's another 30% we don't see that's actually been secreted into the soil as carbon compounds and feeds the soil microbiome, the soil food web. They do a whole range of benefits, and I'll talk more about them. But what I want to explain too here is that, you know, in terms of cover crop or weed management, the fact is because roots are putting in all these carbon compounds, and actually root enzymes and microorganisms are basically making minerals available, with the right management rather than eradication, weeds can actually increase soil fertility or ground covers. That's why cover crops work so well. So let's look at this, and I now want to talk about how to use this system to manage weeds, cover crops, ground covers, whatever you want to call it, whatever word you want to use, without herbicides. And that's what happens is, remember I talked about all those compounds, the carbohydrates, the hormones, the amino acids and all that. They're synthesized in the leaves. People think the plants feed from their roots. They get water from their roots, which is really important. That's the most important. and they get 2 to 5% of their nutrients from the roots. But when you combine water with carbon dioxide and solar energy, most of the biomass and most of what you see and all the compounds of life, the glucose, the hormones, the proteins, everything that they need, the cellulose for their structure, is synthesized in the leaves. Now, when you cut the leaves, suddenly you don't have enough food for the roots. So if you really cut the leaves back, there's not enough food for the roots. The plant has two options. One, it says, I'll let all the roots die because I don't have enough food. Now, that's not a smart one, because if they do that, they die. They go, okay, what I've got to do now is adjust the amount of roots to what I can feed, keep those, and get rid of the others. So you can see here, this is a beautiful example. The more leaves you cut, the more roots it sheds. Look at that, because I'm going to show you this a few more times. So I want that in your mind to think in terms of how we now apply this to our cropping and farming systems. And weeds. I want you to get rid of this notion now that anything that is not our crop is a weed. Because that's what you're taught. You've got to get rid of it. You've got to nuke anything that's not your crop, your cash crop. That's not correct. So I want to show you this here in terms of management. Remember, what we want now, where weeds really compete or where you don't want to compete, is for light. We want our cash crop or our cover crop, whatever we're growing, the one we're growing, to get first access to the light. That's the energy source. That's where most of the biomass of the plant is synthesized and come from. That is the main area of weed competition. Then number two is water. So we want our crop to get the water. So in this case, if we've just cut the weed here, it shed its roots. The leaves of our crop are getting the light, and our roots are deep down getting the water and the minerals. But we can use this as what we call living mulch to protect, hold the soil together. And there's a whole range of other things we can use it for. I haven't got time to go in. We use it for pest control, weed control. There's so many things we can do, but also to conserve moisture by doing it this way, stopping wind and sun going on it. I want to show you, this is my own farm at the end of the wet season. This is my cover crop. These are rambutans. You can see my tractor in there. I'm growing various grasses and legumes that are usually used in cattle that most people regard these are some of the worst weeds ever. But think about it in terms of my, this is the wet season, so I don't need to worry about water competition where I am in Daintree, where I get a few meters a year. But most importantly, light competition is that I make sure that that is not out competing my trees. My trees are actually bigger than that. But really importantly here is that, you know, I went from, this was my soil when I started, less than 1% organic matter. I had a pH of 4.5. It's a pretty miserable block. I remember a couple of weeks after I bought it, I was having a beer with my neighbor next door at the end of the day, and he was saying, you know, I've never seen a crop of fruit off your farm. I went, oh my God, what have I bought? But, and that was because the soil was so poor. But in 11 years, you know, I went from 1% to 6%, and you just see the increase in nutrients there. Now, some of it I put on, but most of that has actually come from the organic matter feeding the microbiomes and making the nutrients available. And I'll talk more about it. One of the things I do want to say, which, you know, when I first took over my farm, I spent every dry season, like now I should be, you know, in the past I wouldn't have been able to come here because I would be irrigating, because irrigating takes a lot of time. You know, running bores, I'm checking every sprinkler. You know, that's all I do all dry season. I haven't turned on my irrigation system for 15 years now. I'm dreading it if I ever have to. I thought this year I would, because it's just our worst year ever. Everything's fine because I've managed to capture, even though we had a failed wet, I still managed to capture enough water that I've had a good lychee crop, and I've got a massive rambutan flowering, durian flowering, mangosteen flowering, and set. There's enough water for it to do it without dropping. The same, you know, go back to this one. It's the same thing again, and I want you to have a look now at, all he did is, in the beginning, is put in a bit of phosphorus, and these are the increases in nutrients. He hasn't put on any fertilizer. He's taken off 2 crops, grains, and animals. You know, technically you say, oh, he's running the system down, he's exporting nutrients. But the biology is making nutrients available, because, you know, the fact is, if we actually look at total nutrients in soils, what's in the rocks, it's almost endless. We go down to the center of the earth. But most of that stuff is not plant available. When we get the biology right, we can actually make many of our nutrients. Not all. Not all. You know, in my farm, I still have to put on boron because I'm on a, you know, a wet area. I do things, I still put on calcium. That's mainly because clays will always lock up potassium. Doesn't matter how much you put on. If you've got a heavy clay soil, it'll go into it. By putting on calcium, you break up the clay, it releases potassium. You know, there's things like that where, you know, you still need to put certain nutrients on. I still use soil tests, but my soil tests have come in the same now every year for the last 12 years. It's reached what I call a stasis, the management. But what I want to talk about here is, think about your microbes, your soil microbiome, as your livestock in the soil. And, you know, essentially the greater amount of feed that you can put into a system, the higher your stocking density. You know, that's a fairly simple rule. It's the same in the soil. The more we can put, you know, essentially the glucose, the more microbes we can get working for us. So, you know, this is an example here of, you know, the amount of sort of microbes we'll have in the soil. It's in pounds per acre. Kilograms per hectare are the same. So if we want to talk about bacteria, that's 2.5 tons of bacteria per hectare in the topsoil. You know, just, you know, under 1.5 tons of Actomycetes, fungi 2.5 tons, and so on, in terms of what can be there in a good soil. We can increase that substantially as well. But, you know, I haven't got time to, you know, to go into great detail. That's where you can bring in other people who can really talk in great detail about it if you want to know, you know. But there are some really important ones like glomalin, for instance, which is secretion by fungus. And it's a sticky secretion, and it's also, they work, this way to say, like reinforcing rods. And they have a really important role also of holding soil together so it doesn't erode, as well as bring nutrients out. Sorry. The other one are the VAM fungi that, in this case, they actually live in the roots, and their mycelium go out into the soil. We know that they actually can extend the reach of roots by miles, because each plant, because they, or kilometers, because the mycelium is so thin, but they mine minerals and bring it into plants. They are really important for helping plants take up nutrients. We know in Australia, particularly for phosphorus, they do that in exchange for glucose. They live on the root, and because they can't photosynthesize, they get the glucose. In exchange, the plant will get phosphorus or potassium or whatever nutrient, nitrogen, whatever they want. The other one with organic matter, and I won't go too much into it, but is building a really good soil structure with lots of soil spaces. And this is really important for air. Everybody thinks, well, air is important for oxygen, for roots. Plants actually breathe through their roots. There's only a few plants that can actually send oxygen from their leaves to their roots, like water lilies, water plants. So, some of the mangroves can do it. But most plants, the roots themselves breathe, they need oxygen. And this is why plants can die quickly in waterlogged soils. It's why we need lots of air spaces. And plants are like us, you know. We can live for weeks without food, days without water, but how long can we live without oxygen? Not very long. And it's the same with plant roots. So they will die, and then, you know, that causes a number of problems. The other thing is air. Everybody thinks it's oxygen, but what is the main gas in air? Nitrogen. And what is percentage? Yeah. Yeah, it's well, yeah, actually 78%. Plants are bathed in nitrogen, but I'll talk more about it. But that air, that nitrogen in the air can be fixed by microorganisms to give free nitrogen to our plants. So that's a really important issue, and I'll go through that quickly at the end to show you the multiple ways that can be done, so you don't have to spend money on nitrogen fertilizer, on the tons of urea that cost a fortune. This is an example of, in the United States, again, average soil, of the amount of nutrients that and in this case, an acre and 6.5 inches, what they call the plow zone, which is about 550 millimeters, and but if we, this is pounds per acre. If we, oh, sorry, lost it again. If we, where am I? How do I do that? If we turn that into kilograms per hectare, we're starting to look at, look at this figure, the average, it's being really naughty to me, isn't it? The average sandy loam has, over a ton of nitrogen. You go up to clay loams, you've got 6 tons of nitrogen average, and yet we've got to put it on. What's going on there? Most soils actually have these sorts of things. And if you start looking at things like, potash and phosphorus, the sort of numbers there, American soils generally have higher amounts than us, but still, we still have substantial amounts of these nutrients, and yet we still have to put it on. That to me, says, well, if we've got that in the soil, why are we buying it and putting it on? That's bad management. You're not taught how to actually get that out of your soil and give it to your plant. You're taught, no, you've got to buy it. You don't have to buy it if you've got it. You've got to release it and make it plant available. And that's what microorganisms do. I put a whole lot there. I'm not going to go into great detail and read it all out, but the evidence of how they can actually dissolve minerals from rocks and make these locked up minerals available is overwhelming. There are thousands of scientific studies showing this. We've known this since people like Darwin wrote about it. Von Liebig in 1846, who's the one who invented chemical fertilizers, wrote about it. It was actually one of the major ways agriculture was going until after World War II, when the push was for the Green Revolution and chemical fertilizers, and all this is forgotten. And can I say that chemical fertilizers actually suppress the biological way of doing it? The organic matter, the organic acids, humic, fulvic, fulvic, there's so many, they do it as well. The pathways out there in which between microorganisms and organic matter to make minerals available are numerous. But I want to get back down to it, is that without having to go into real technical detail, the key is to feed this system. And what do we feed it with? Glucose. How do we do it? Through photosynthesis, solar energy. We maximize what we put in there. We maximize what happens there and what comes out. Plant roots also. So microorganisms, organic matter do it, and plant roots themselves put out enzymes and other things. But also around plant roots is where the highest concentration of microbes are. It's called the rhizosphere, the most biodiverse area on the planet. A teaspoon of rhizosphere soil contains billions and billions of organisms, most of which we don't know about yet, only starting to categorize them. But, some of them, for instance, now that we can use computers to sequence them, we're starting to understand how they work. For instance, in terms of disease suppression, there are cohorts of 30,000 species that work together. This is some of the most complex systems. But that plant roots are essential to feeding this system. I really want to get it across again. Instead of this idea, we need to get rid of anything that's not our crop. Actually, why not allow these other systems to use the light our crop isn't using to photosynthesize and feed the soil and put in more compounds? This is what it is about, using living systems, biology, to feed the soil. So let's talk about how to get humus again. I talked about the importance of this for water retention. So I've been talking about cellulose, which is the sugar which feeds the system. The other part of plants are called lignins. Lignins are the reason, why plants can be flexible. They're a polymer. Best way to say it is a bit like a plastic reinforcing rod. Why plants, don't blow over. Oh, well, they do, but what I mean is why they can flex in the wind. Most of the time, they just don't always snap. And it's lignins. Lignins are particularly found in mature plants. Young plants, when they're growing, can break very easily because they don't have the lignins. As plants mature and get old and coarse, they have the lignins. So what we really want to do to get humus is to have lignified organic matter. We really want to allow our grasses and our crops and things to get coarse before we look at how we return them into the soil, either through slashing or grazing or incorporating. That is really important. Old lignified material that is long lasting. It actually lasts for thousands of years. CSIRO work shows the average age of humus polymers that come from lignins in our forests is 2,000 years. It's very viable, looked after. But really importantly, I want to get across here is this thing of total ion exchange capacity in the soil. The humus is sticky, and sticky actually is the word we use, for scientists will call that electrostatic. Has the ability for ions, nutrients, to stick to it. And because it's not water soluble, what it means is when it rains, they don't leach out. They stay stuck to it. They have ability, clays, for instance, can hold cations, but the charges on them, the best way to say is it's electrostatic charges. It's a bit like magnets. And the charges on clays, if you get a North Pole and a South Pole of magnet, they stick together. And so cations are positively charged, clay is negatively charged. So so cations like calcium and potassium and magnesium will stick to clays. But the anions, which are negatively charged, which are generally our nitrogen compounds, sulfur, phosphorus, there's no sites for them because they're negatively charged. So if you get two magnets, two south poles, and you put them against each other, what do? They push each other away. We used to do that at school. It's the same thing. The clay is negatively charged. The nitrogen is negatively charged. You get water. what happens? It pushes the nitrogen away. There's nowhere for it to stay. And then as the water drains out, it leaches out with the nitrogen and, you know, the phosphorus and the sulfur and other things that we want in the soil. Humus has both negative and positive sites. So the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potassium can hold on it. Now, in soils, we have a lot of soils actually, you get soil tests. I talk about what's called cation exchange capacity, which is the positively charged elements, but plants need cations and anions. So I prefer to get what in my soil test is total exchange capacity, which is both cations and anions. Now, the best way to talk about that is your nutrient fuel tank. How much in the way of plant nutrients can be stored? So it's, oh, I didn't do that. That's not exactly, but, you know, it's once again the same thing. If you've got a low cation exchange capacity, that's the amount of nutrients you can store. Any other nutrients flow off and go into the water system, into the Great Barrier Reef. You know, we don't want it there. We want it in our plants. So if you've got a high cation exchange capacity, you can store it all there. And in the wet season, when it rains, it doesn't leach out because it's actually stuck to the humus. And so I want to show you how plants get it off, because what you're taught is the only way that plants take nutrients is through the soil solution. You know, they've got to be water soluble, otherwise, and the plants take it up for the roots. And that's true. Something is water soluble and the plants drink it, they take it up. You know, if I was to pour salt in here and I drink it, I take it up, you know, or a little bit of coffee here, I take it up, whether I want to or not. So we're force feeding plants. But in this case, these nutrients aren't in the soil solution. They are stuck through electrostatic charges. A negative charge there, so we get something like potassium or magnesium is stuck to it. You know, or we got positively charged where we can actually put something like nitrate. We'll stick to it. And when the water comes there, it's not dissolving it. Remember I said before, humus is not water soluble. And so these nutrients stay there. The same way you saw that soil keep its integrity. Not only does the soil keep its integrity, really importantly, these ions or these nutrients that our plants want are still there. They're not being leached away. So how do the plants get it then if it's not in the water? Well, they use what is called ion exchange. Water, we know it as H2O, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, but actually what it is, it's a hydrogen, which is a plus, and an OH, oxygen, and a hydrogen, which is actually a negative, called a hydroxyl. And plants will split it and push out the hydrogen. That's positively charged, send it out there. And remember I said before, what happens when you've got two magnets of the same charge? One will push the other. It pushes, displaces the calcium. So this is potassium here. I'm using an example. Kalium is the Latin name for potassium. So, and then what happens? Well, because in electricity, everything has to be neutral. The charges have to balance. This positive hydrogen now sticks to the negative here, but because you've got a negative hydroxyl there, this positive potassium now is attracted into the root. That's called ion exchange. And if you want to say get nitrogen, the plant does it the other way around. It sends out the hydroxyl. You know, plants can select. And people say, how do they do it? Well, we don't know. But the fact is, all living things can select. You know, we eat this food, and somehow our body knows how to break it down, change it into all these different things, and put the different nutrients into the different, the millions of or billions of different cells. How does it do it? Well, we don't quite know. But if living organisms couldn't select and move and compounds and put them together and synthesize, we would not be living. We have a lot to understand. There's a fraction of what we don't understand. But what we do understand is this, is that when we look at natural ecosystems, the ion exchange is the major way plants take up nutrients, not from water-soluble fertilizers. No one fertilizes up our rainforests here. This is what happens in the forests, in the grasslands. No one's out fertilizing all the savannas. You don't need to. We've got this happening through ion exchange. So, basically, I just want to quickly now, because I'm getting the wind up, is just show you examples of applying this. So, these are some of the new no-till systems. And, in this case, you use a cover crop. They roll it. They actually just plant in it and grow soybeans. There's another thing, another cover crop. They vetch, they grow it. They drilled in maize, and the good thing here is that as the maize goes up, it shades out the the weeds, and these systems are some of the highest yielding. This is in America, where they actually keep the records of yields. This is bushels per acre, and they got 160 bushels per acre compared to the 130 county average for conventional. And I think what's really interesting here is when you look at the diesel used in conventional tillage as against these systems, that's a massive saving. So not only is you're getting a higher yield, is lower production costs on numerous levels with these systems. And but the last thing I want to end on is nitrogen, because nitrogen is one of the most important nutrients in our farming systems. It's what gets combined with glucose to make all the amino acids, proteins, and stuff. It's an essential nutrient. The big trouble is, what we do know is that when you put on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, it actually eats up. It actually stimulates microbes that eat up all the soil carbon. So it eats up all the residue plus the soil carbon, and it's a loss of around 10,000 kilograms of soil carbon per hectare. The higher the application, the greater the loss of soil organic matter and carbon. I want to get this across because I showed you the difference between the organic systems and the conventional systems. Most conventional systems lose carbon. There's a few that get slight increases, but scientists are just talking about slowing down the rate of loss as best practice. Why scientists say it's impossible to build up soil organic matter. They're looking at the wrong systems. More than tillage. Wrong tillage can be a problem, but believe me, soil nitrogen is the main culprit. This is good scientific research. What I'd like to show you is that soil organic matter has a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So depending on the soil, between 12 to 1, carbon to nitrogen to 9 to 1. Now, for the sake of this, I just want to show you, just say we'll pretend 10 to 1, and I'm not going to go through the maths, run out of time, but I just want to show you this graph. At 10 to 1, if we look at each percentage of this is soil organic matter. When I show you the one with water is soil organic matter, because the relationship is soil organic carbon the relationship of carbon to organic matter, we multiply by 1.7%. But, you know, let's look at this 6%, which is was what I used for getting up about around a megaliter of water, soil organic matter. You're looking at just under 10 tons of organic nitrogen per hectare. But what I want to get across here is if you want to increase nitrogen in your system, you increase soil organic matter because of that relationship. Each time you increase the soil organic carbon, you increase the amount of nitrogen in your system. And I want to say is this nitrogen is available. When you get told, oh, look, the only nitrogen that is used by plants comes either as nitrate or ammonium, you know, that is not right. Yes, plants use that. But when we look at natural systems, most of the nitrogen that comes up is what we call organic forms in peptides, which are precursors to amino acids and simple amino acids. And other organic forms, and that is taken up. And we have hundreds of papers. So it's about how we make this viable. And quickly, before I get cut off, I just want to go through some of the ways of doing it. You know, this is where, you know, that system I'm showing where we grow a cover crop below our cash crop. In this case, lupins in grapes. That's a beautiful one for grapes because they're asleep in winter and you grow, you know, and there's winter legumes like lupins. My grandfather used to use vetches for the same thing and grow all the nitrogen. When spring comes, these things go, the cover crop goes to sleep and the grapes wake up with a lovely dose of nitrogen to go into a good crop. This is one of my favorite. I haven't got a lot of time to talk about this, but growing desmodium as a prostrate low cover crop. In this case, maize, but you can use it in sugarcane. You can use it in I'll show you mangoes and chilies, whatever. There's millions of ways of doing this. It suppresses weeds because it causes their suicidal germination. It adds nitrogen, conserves the soil, actually repels pests. It actually was developed for repelling the stem borer and stopping a parasitic weed in Africa. But it's one of, you know, I suppose what I'm trying to show you now is that with the right choice of cover crop added in, we can increase production. I want to get rid of this idea of we need bare soil, we need to nuke weeds. These systems increase production. Neil, I just wanted to show you this. This is work we did here in Mackay. When Neil was involved in organic sugarcane and trialing different legumes, in this case soybeans, which adds free nitrogen. But what I like to say is that this system is actually used commercially in many countries in cane, and particularly in Egypt and Thailand, where they'll actually do soybeans and mung beans and harvest them. I can tell you at the moment they make more money off the beans in the interrow than they do off the sugar. But it has other benefits in terms of suppressing weeds, shading them out, and also these systems actually produce more sugar per hectare. So, you know, I'm just showing you this to do it. This is where a desmodium and or I'll put alfalfa, we call it lucerne, but you can use other legumes that are growing in with different crops like chilies and capsicums or under mangoes, and once again getting really high yields. The other one which we know of now, you know, this is CSIRO, but where we can actually fix most of the nitrogen by increasing soil organic matter is by free living soil microorganisms. I talked about the spaces that that you get in the soil when you've got a lot of organic matter to get that air in. Well, these microorganisms then take that nitrogen in the air and they fix it, and they fix substantial amounts of soil organic matter now with the right management. The last one I want to end on is this, and this is the beginning of what I think is where we can actually commercialize and take this knowledge and this science. It's what we call endophytic nitrogen fixing bacteria. Actually, there's a whole range of endophytic. Endophytic means it lives in plant roots. So we know, the real common one are the rhizobium in legumes. We all know that. But the other ones are the VAM fungi, which they get phosphorus and put into the roots of plants. But what is really exciting now is a whole group of them that you can inoculate crops with. I'm showing you rice here, and it essentially turns the rice into a legume. It fixes its own nitrogen with this. They actually, in Thailand now and India, they actually have strains they use for sugarcane. And we're seeing it in wheat, and they're actually finding what we call the superior strains and commercializing it. So I suppose what I want to end on here, which is the really, the positive note is this, is that, with these systems, we can, like I said, we can reverse climate change, but very importantly, give resilience to our farming systems. I just want to get that across in terms of capturing rainfall, in terms of keeping the soil together when we get heavy rains, keeping the nutrients in place and building up the nutrients. In other words, getting a lot of our nutrients for our farming system unlocked from the soil rather than having to buy it in bags. I'm not saying you still won't, you still will have to. In my case, there's still some things I have to get. This isn't we get everything for free, but it's a substantial reduction in what we need to bring onto our farm by managing this system. And I want to end on this is because I've shown you what can be done, but what we really need to do is take it to the next stage, get this science, this newly emerging science, and start putting our research dollars into this area and commercializing. Think about this, endophytic nitrogen bacteria. If, in Australia, someone started to commercialize, we found forms that we could use in sugarcane. All we had to do is inoculate the sugarcane and save, and not have to use urea. The money would save, not have to worry about nitrogen or leak going out into the Great Barrier Reef. This is multiple win-win-win, plus we start a new industry by commercializing it. And we have numerous opportunities with this technology to do this, to start new industries and to make our existing industries more profitable, higher yielding, and at lower costs, and more resilient to a changing climate. So thank you.